Lisa Mercer and Teresa Moses here to talk about their wonderful and I believe transformative project and toolkit, Racism Untaught. And so I want to give Lisa and Teresa the opportunity to share with the rest of the class about this project and also about their individual work, and so that we can be inspired. And Lisa and Teresa, one of the things that I'll be sharing more of with our students is how we'll be integrating an abbreviated model of your toolkit into the rest of the semester, which is very related to what we're already doing. But I also want to get student feedback about how we might be able to incorporate this in future semesters. I think that it kind of serves both purposes. But without further ado, please share with us more about Racism Untaught.
Okay,
awesome.
So first, we like to start with a land acknowledgement, and UNT had a lengthy one, and so I sort of changed it up just a little bit just to the full acknowledgement, but I included what they had asked us to on the entire page. So I'll read it first. We would like to open our event today by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Wichita, Caddo, Comanche, and Cherokee tribes. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders, both past and present.
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Lisa Mercer, and I go by she, her pronouns. And I have been, I teach as an assistant professor in graphic design at the University of Illinois. I'm also a grad co-coordinator, so I work with all of our grad students, and we recently changed our graphic design graduate program to a Design for Responsible Innovation grad program. So we're really excited about that change next semester, or next year. Yeah.
Awesome. So my name is Teresa Moses, and I also use she, her pronouns. I am an assistant professor of design at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and I also co-own a studio called Blackbird Revolt. We do social justice-based design work, so campaigns and branding and web, print, all that stuff, based around our mission, which is to promote social change. So we do a lot of work with nonprofits and folks trying to inspire specifically anti-racist work, queerness, and anti-violence work.
Wonderful.
So as a design educator, one of the things that I do in my classes is make sure that all of my projects are socially conscious based. And so one of the first projects that our graphic design 1 students, so students who have already taken their foundational courses and are moving into their kind of sophomore year or second year in the program, the first project that they'll work with through my class, Graphic Design 1, is a project that kind of uncovers Black history. And so what this is like a very multi-layered project. What students will do is, well, I'll assign them something around the Black experience. So each year has been different. So the first one was like activists. The second one was music. The third one was moments. So like, bus boycott, things like that. So I'll assign them something around the Black experience. They have to do that research on that, write stuff about that, answer questions about that, and then they have to visualize that. So it's a really interesting experience for students to understand, how then do I visualize, police brutality, or, how do I visualize Freedom by Beyonce. So, it's a really fun experience for them. And it gains a lot of traction in our community. Not only that, but they have to communicate, whatever message it is that they are researching. They have to be inspired by a Black designer. So then I'll assign them not only just the instance itself, but then also the Black designer that they will need to work from and learn about. And then after that, they create a poster, and then they also create a booklet that has all the information and stuff that they are gathering. And then they sell it at the NAACP's Freedom Fund dinner. 50% of those profits will go towards the NAACP, and then 50% go back to them. So what students are learning is that they can make a difference. They can learn about history that's not theirs, because I probably have had like 2 Black students since I've been teaching here. So I have a mainly white audience, and trying to open them up to be designers for all people, so that it's really important for them to understand Black history and those experiences, to be able to design for people who don't hold the same experiences as they do. And so it's a very multi-layered project, and the outcome is some of the photos that you're seeing here.
That's beautiful.
Sorry, there we go. So this is a Get Real Immersive Reality Challenge that I've taught at the University of Illinois. And I taught this, I co-taught it with a professor in industrial design. And the project was all focused on developing immersive reality experiences for people who are currently incarcerated working towards reentry. So I was approached about creating a course focused on virtual reality, and for very similar reasons to what Teresa just said, I really like to make sure that everything I'm doing really teaches and shows students that you can focus on developing for social impact or designing for social impact. And so I reached out to the educational justice program on our campus run by Dr. Rebecca Ginsburg. And she goes into detention centers and teaches people who are currently incarcerated university courses. And she also helps them work towards reentry. And so I asked her, is this something that we can work together on? And she said, one of the things that they need to learn are just the simple, the basic social constructs that we have that they have forgotten by being incarcerated for 20 years or more. And so they asked to learn things like, how do I cross the street? How do I order a Big Mac at McDonald's? How do I order a Starbucks drink? How do I order a coffee? How do I get a library card? And they also asked us some questions that we decided not to have the students focus on, like, what happens if a police officer pulls me over? How do I react to that? Or how do I check the mail with an ankle bracelet on that monitors my movement? And so the entire 16 weeks was focused on not just the development of the experience, but the development of a headset as well. So we really try to integrate both the design and a social impact side to the course. So Racism Untaught initially was started because Terry and I were really trying to figure out how to develop a project that we could both focus on. And it really started when we were both in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and there was a shooting with the Dallas PD. And the conversation was going from why Black Lives Matter and then the all lives matter. And we knew that there was like a point that was being missed. Mm-hmm. And so we started to do research that was really preempted by the presidential election. And so we stopped working on that, and we took a break, and then we started working together again about 9 months later, I'd say, roughly about that. And I had invited her to campus, and we were having lunch, and we thought, wouldn't it be amazing if when people ask us, how do you incorporate this stuff into every class that you're doing, how could we create a tool that enabled design educators to do this in a way that they were comfortable, and even, empower them to do it in a way that they would be really proud of and really would help their students learn how to develop design for social impact. And so the tools that we have come up with for Racism Untaught has really come from that background.
So when we talk about, racism, we always like to start off by giving what our definition is. So, when we give examples that folks are going to work through with the toolkit, we're not saying there's no argument about if it's racist or not. It is racist, and you need to find out how to make something or design something that will create anti-racist environment. So when we talk about racism, a really simple definition for that is prejudice and power. So you can be prejudiced and be a Black person, or prejudiced and be Mexican or whatever. But if you don't hold the power, there's no way that you can encompass racism. So in this country, the United States, it is white folks who are racist against the other folks of color. So that's what we mean when we talk about racism, is this social construct that primarily determines human capacities and and has white folks, systems or structures have been set up to put white folks in a place of privilege.
So one thing that we like to do is define racism, but also what racialized design is. So racialized design is design that perpetuates elements of racism. And what the toolkit really does is helps people or designers who are both in practice and in academia identify, contextualize, and reimagine artifacts, systems, and experiences that are racialized design. And so one of the things that we often hear when we're running this toolkit, especially since we're both running it on a historically white college and university campus, is that students are saying, and Teresa, you can speak more to this as well, that our students are saying, I haven't had this conversation in the other class, or we haven't been able to really analyze artifacts, systems, and experiences in this way. And so we're having conversations that they just haven't had in a design class before. And so it's really exciting to hear those conversations and to hear them support one another. One thing that we do as well is we create community agreements when we're teaching this class. And so it really helps students see that this is a safe and brave space that we're trying to create to have these conversations. In the first 2 weeks of the class, we're focused on really getting to know the students and helping them understand their own positionality in the context of racism. And so the first 2 weeks is really focused on understanding who the students are. And we invite other guest speakers in so that way they can understand, they can even further those conversations around the positionality as well as privilege. And so that's the first part of the course that we typically run.
So when we introduce some of the design elements that students are going to be looking at, or organizations, whoever is running the toolkit, we like to talk about design in 3 different areas. So the first one being artifacts, the second being systems and experiences. So this one here is an example of an artifact that most folks, I say most as in majority, like the white folks in our nation might not think this is a racialized design artifact. However, emojis, the default one is the yellow. And so most people of color will use the one that is most like their skin tone. What that does is allows white folks to not have to identify racially, and they continue using the yellow one, which then makes the yellow one become the default of white. So then people of color are forced to bring race into the conversation, even though they're just using something that looks like their skin tone, whereas white folks kind of have a way out of identifying themselves by using the default yellow. So while it's, it may not be looked at that way, the use of the yellow emoji has become this kind of default allowance for white folks to kind of skip the conversation of race when they're interacting with folks on, on the digital, device, which is like a really huge thing now, especially because we're like all digital, right? So this is an artifact. The second one here being a system. And so when you talk about like the educational system, and we think about how Black girls and Black women are hypersexualized within these systems and often treated very unfairly, especially when it comes to like punishment or doing the same things as their white counterparts, but then being punished at a harsher level. So one of the things that I look at in the system of education is dress code violations, because Black women have been hypersexualized since slavery. It plays out into our educational system right now. And so you see all 3 of these girls have been suspended from their educational institution because of what they were wearing. Whereas if someone who was white was wearing the same thing, they would not have gotten the same sentence per se. This is an example of a system that continues to perpetuate elements of racism. And then lastly, we think about experiences, and we talk about appropriation. That's a big one, a big element of racism that shows up. And really when we talk about appropriation, we're talking about the fact that people of color can do something that is specific to their heritage or their culture, and they get made fun of, or they get called ghetto, or they get called whatever. And then when someone who is white or, you know, someone who's accepted more in mainstream, it is able to do those same things, and then they're accepted, or they're given money for what they're doing, or, you know, it's a new trend. And so we see that a lot with folks like Kim Kardashian. We see that with this person, I think her name is Little Baby or something, Catch Me Outside, the Catch Me Outside girl. So we see them kind of taking things from Blackness and then appropriating them wherever they see fit, and then it now becomes a trend or acceptable within United States culture.
So this is a picture of the cards and the workboards that we've actually put together. The cards on the left that you see are just an example of what we eventually want them to look like. Right now, they're out of paper, and we hole punch all of them for every workshop and class that we run. But the hope is to actually have them printed on clear, like acetate paper, maybe not acetate, but a little thicker. So that way that when people start to collect or to start to pick out the ones that apply to the artifact system or experience they're analyzing, they can see how much overlap there is. And the deeper the color just means the more of the cards that represent the racist elements that apply to that artifact system or experience. So overall, through the whole toolkit, we have approximately 250 cards, and they are divided out, not equally by any means. I think the yellow one has the most with 100 cards, but they are divided out per step.
And then,
sorry.
And then what you see on the right-hand side is the workboard. The workboard is about 60 inches long and then 30 inches high. And what this is just a visualization of the design research process. We have changed the last step to not be the word test, but the word impact. And we thought it was important for folks to understand that we're not testing out your anti-racist design, but you're actually measuring the impact of that. So we changed the word and definition for that. You'll also notice that on each of the steps, there's like a light gray dotted line that goes across and goes back. And that's to let folks know that the design research process isn't just you move on to first step and then you move on to the second and you move on to the third. If you get to the third step and you're like, I think I don't understand something, you know, maybe my intent was really good, but the impact is still pretty negative. You might need to go back to the define step, or you might need to go back and contextualize that thing again so that you have a full understanding. And I think it's really important as design researchers for us to understand that we can go forward and back, recognizing that design, you know, needs to be very fluid and it needs to be flexible and adjustable. You'll also notice that there's certain elements within each step that we'll have folks fill out, and we'll go through those as we move throughout the steps. But this is the full workboard in the digital format.
Mm.
And
so this is
next.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, this is an image after one of the workshops we've completed. So this is not by any means like a clean process. Like, we expect it to get a little messy, and we invite students to. We usually typically have these on all the walls in the room where we're teaching or running a workshop. And then we either tape or tack or somehow attach the cards to each step. And we encourage students when they're doing research to continue to build upon around the board. They'll even add more images or some of the research that they're learning, so that way they can visually see the process as well.
Mm-hmm.
Here's just an example of the archive that we're building on Racism Untaught. So if folks are interested in seeing more about the toolkit and more about instances of racism, they can go to racismuntaught.com and see kind of the archive that we're building of racialized design. They can even look for just systems, just experiences, just artifacts on the top of the page there. But this website has everything, like most of the things that we've been doing this far. Okay, so like Lisa said, in 2018 is when we kind of started. This is like May, I think, was our first workshop that we ran. And then that, was it the next semester? It was probably the spring semester after we decided to run this in our classes for the first time. So this is, so like she was saying, you know, we have them up on the walls. This is like kind of like a cork wall there, but like kind of pin stuff in there. And this was my class. So I had 18 students. And so each group was made up of 6 people, and I had 3 different groups. This class is a packaging course. And so I was like, well, how can I run Racism Untaught within a packaging course? I know, let's assign racist packaging. So as you see up there, their assignment was Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. So that was the two items that they got to look at as a team together and work through and recreate and anti-racist packaging. And so this is just a kind of an image of them working together on, it looks like the last step there. Mm-hmm. And so what the students ended up creating through looking at Aunt Jemima is just one example. They did do both. But what they looked at was how, like, one, why did Aunt Jemima even exist in the first place? And it was, you know, to kind of bring in this archetype of Black women in the kitchen, like that being their role, cooking for white families. Whenever you think about delicious meals, you think about Black women cooking them. And so that's where Aunt Jemima really stemmed from, was being a slave in a white household. And so not only just moving from that original packaging, but to the last one is like, how do we move to there? We can't just move to a new package and just say it's all good. So it's like we have to kind of do some type of public apology, which we talked about really heavily in the classroom as being something that companies do not like to do. There's a lot of like bland responses, like, I'm sorry if we offended. And it's just like, no, you were perpetuating racism, and I think you need to call that out. And so they creatively came up with a really, I think, funny way of talking about how they've been racist since they originated, and using not only this packaging as a way to inform and talk about stereotypes and stereotypes against Black women, but then also they creatively thought of, okay, well, where does all this money go to? So we had conversations about reparations. So when we're talking about design, it's not just like, oh, a pretty poster or oh, pretty packaging, but then there's like so many different layers in this system that we can begin to right wrongs. And so on the second image there, that was their transition packaging, which was a public apology box. But then also the money would go back to the family of Nancy Green, who the image was originally taken from, to be able to kind of repair the harm that had been done to her and her family. And then also, as you move into the third image, which is the last final image, it still had kind of the feel of like that red box and the pancakes on top, but it's not a Black woman in your kitchen cooking for you, it's you. And so they called it Yours Truly, which I thought was a really creative response and a great way of saying, not only are we creating something that's just like taking off Aunt Jemima's face and making this not racist anymore, but the transition packaging, I think, added the anti-racist element, which is what we want students and organizations who are using the toolkit to be able to come to. So this was over a full semester's worth of work for them to get down to this bottom part. And then, like Lisa mentioned before, we do have guest speakers come in. So we had a lot of people come in, critique the work, have them go back to the drawing board. They went back quite a few times to get to this point. So
that's wonderful.
This is a graduate case study that I ran at the University of Illinois. There were, this is only showing 6 students, but there were 8 students in the semester. And I asked students to help me understand the power structures that had allowed the former Chief Illini WEC mascot to stay on campus 10 years after it had been retired. So I've only been at the University of Illinois this is at the end of my 3rd year. And so when they did this, I was at the end of my 2nd year. And I didn't understand why the former mascot was still around after it had been retired in 2007. And at that point, it's been 13 years now. So it's been quite a while. And that's what they studied for the whole 16 weeks. They did everything from, it culminated into an exhibit. And the exhibit was visited by people from the Native American House, and also from people, we have a Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and we have an office. And all of them came, as well as the dean and the director. And we invited people from the community as well as other students to give feedback. And what you can see in this last image right here, if I can figure out where my mouse is that they had to map their experience. So they would go around the whole room through the exhibit, and then they would be able to track what their experiences through the exhibit and to see if they learned anything new. And the hope from the students was not to perpetuate the argument of why the mascot should be allowed, even after so long, it had been retired for so long, was to understand why there were 2 conversations happening. They felt like the university was perpetuating this stronger, dominant conversation over why the mascot should still be allowed, but then ignoring all the really important questions like, reparations, and how do we provide support to people from Native American communities that were removed from the land that the university now stands. So how could we further perpetuate or support the conversations that were not being had because they kept shaking one hand much bigger than the other one?
Okay, so we're going to move through the toolkit today, and what we like to do is to move through with an example. And we thought, how can we be relevant today? Coronavirus. And we decided to take the example of Donald Trump taking the corona out of the word coronavirus and switching it for the word Chinese, and talking about how that perpetuates racism, especially from our highest office within the nation. So we thought this would be a really relevant example to kind of pull through. So as we talk about the steps, we'll bring back what we might have pulled out from this example in that specific step. So, all right. So the first step is context. And again, as Lisa was talking about earlier, racialized design is design that has elements of racism. And so what you see here is some folks pulling out cards, the first step of cards, which basically has all these different words that are all elements of racism. So you might see microaggressions, or you might see aversive racism, or you might see stereotyping or whatever. And so that's what folks will move through first in this first step, is like, we have this now racialized design thing. What are the parts of racism, or what are the elements of racism that show up, and which ones don't? Okay. So when we talk to this, we walk through this with students, we talk about not only bring out the ones that show up, so the whys, but also why the why nots. So we were talking about the Chinese virus phrase that Trump used. We can also say, well, redlining probably isn't an element of racism that shows up in that example. And here's what redlining is. So not only are folks who are working through the toolkit able to understand why things are showing up. So, oh, maybe that's a microaggression, but then define other elements of racism that maybe they didn't know about, and figure out why the whys and why nots. Right. So when we talk about this example of the Chinese virus, here's some of the cards that we might have pulled out. So maybe aversive racism, explicit bias, othering, institutional racism. And institutional racism I thought was a really huge one because, because he sits in the highest office within our nation, it really perpetuates the institution, which I'll bring out in the next slide that talks about the overall system. Prejudice, power, I had prejudice on that twice, sorry, and xenophobia. So those are just some of the things that we think about, or some of the elements of racism we might have pulled out in those cards and set in the middle of that workboard and said, here are the things that we think are showing up, so that we further contextualize what's actually happening, so that we can begin to solve for those things. Right. So at the bottom of the workboard, if you saw when you saw on the really huge one a few slides back, is we also have just added this year the levels of oppression. So the levels of oppression, what that is just, this is kind of a diagram of that, but it really starts with like the individual person. So those individual beliefs at the very small circle there, personal beliefs, the ideas, your feelings. So that, that one person who wants to call all Black people the N-word, like those are your personal beliefs that you think people are. And then agentic action is, do you actually act on those things, right? So that person who wants to call all Black people the N-word, maybe that's where it shows up that they're actually calling people the N-word out in public. So that's what that circle is, that second the second smallest circle, agentic action. So what are the agents doing to perpetuate that individual belief? And then the third circle there is institutional. So what are the policies that are enacted in our institutions that help further support the agentic action? So when you hear about those things on campus, like, oh, so-and-so took off the hijab of somebody after Trump was elected because, because there was a lot of stuff happening at our campus. So that was agentic action. But how was our institution, our college, perpetuating that or allowing that thing to happen, right? What were the consequences? Like there's so many things that happen institutionally that allow agentic action to be a thing, to happen, right? And then we have our larger circle, which is cultural. The largest circle is the biggest one because all of those things fit within it. So if culture hasn't changed, none of those other things will. So an example that I like to talk about is with alcohol, the consumption of alcohol. When institutions set up laws that made alcohol illegal, did those things actually change? No. They had speakeasies, they had secret places that they could get alcohol, because the culture around alcohol hadn't changed. So no matter what institutional policies and laws were created, because the culture hadn't changed, none of those other things did. So I also like to give another example around smoking. Smoking is not currently illegal within our nation, but because the culture of smoking is like, you die from it. Like there was all these commercials about like, here's what your lungs look like, blah, blah, blah. And so now the culture around smoking is different. It doesn't matter what institutional laws are in place. People have kind of stopped smoking, right? So we saw the culture shift in like those two different ways, right? Either culture is going to shift and then change all those other things, or maybe those things aren't even necessary. But it doesn't happen from the law level. So like, as much as like I'm an activist and organizer, and as much as I want to organize and like create policy change, no matter what kind of policy change I create, I have to have culture that's going to support what I'm trying to change. And so that's the bigger question that we're trying to solve when we're talking about making anti-racist things, is how do we create an environment and experience in which culture changes so that it does begin to affect institutional, agentic, and personal beliefs.
Yes. I love that diagram.
Yeah, it's really helpful. I mean, you know, again, if you go back to the Donald Trump thing, you know, that was agentic. Sorry, go back to the system. Yeah. I was just talking about the example.
Okay,
if you go back, Donald Trump, he actually said it, right? So that's agentic action. That's where that instance followed up. But he has personal beliefs that are racist, which is what allowed that agentic action to like form, right? And then institutionally, because he sits in the highest ranking office in the nation, it perpetuates institutionally. So then we have to be relying on, you know, in our culture bubble, we have to be relying on what's the news saying about it? Like, how's the news twisting it up? Are they actually calling it out? I mean, I think it's because the channels that I listen to are like calling it out, but like, is all the news stations calling it out? Are they actually, you know, agreeing with it? Like, so culture begins to, you know, be affected because this person, I mean, I feel like he's kind of right there in the middle of institutional agentic action because he sits in that office, you know, so a lot of power.
Yeah, and I would even say, just to bring it back to like an example that we've used in the toolkit, like in my classroom, I used an example, do you speak your native language? As somebody being asked that question. And in one of the groups that I had 2 students who had been asked that question, and 2 students who had never been asked that question and didn't even understand what that question meant. And so to hear them have that conversation about what that felt culturally and the impact that it had with that agentic action being taken was really amazing, just to hear students be like, I never thought of it that way. And for them to even just come to a realization of the privilege they have and not having to think about that. So
yeah. I think one aspect that I think is really important in what you all are doing, that I think relates to some of the content that we've had in the course so far. And I know that as a part of your toolkit is to have outside educators, partners, to experts in this research to contribute to the conversation. And we had our diversity and inclusion office to come in and talk about cultural humility. And one of the elements that was mentioned was that, you know, are we all are experiencing these different levels in which you're talking about, and in what ways in which are they visible or invisible, where is there privilege and oppression for each individual person, so that we all can kind of see ourselves as being a part of the conversation, instead of like, well, this is only dealing with people of color and this doesn't really apply to me. And that actually diversity and inclusion applies to everybody, you know, if we're looking at those different examples. I think that's important. That's an important point that I want to bring up for students who are watching the video, that's a connection point there for sure.
Yeah. Can you go back one slide, Lisa? So if you look at this levels of oppression, a lot of times when we talk about racism, what holds people up is that they believe racism is when a white person calls a black person the N-word. And they think it's like only when people do hateful things and they only talk mean to somebody, that's what racism is. And it's like, racism is a cultural thing, right? That supports all of our healthcare, our education, all of these institutions perpetuate elements of racism. And I think when we talk about racism, people like to just talk about those agentic actions. And it's like, yes, while that's a reflection of it, there's a much larger conversation around what our institutions are set up and who they're set up for, right? And I think people don't want to give themselves enough power to be like, oh, I actually sit in a place of privilege, or my circle has people of privilege that I can actually affect that institutional change. But that's why I love this systems of oppression, because it's like agentic action is it's the second smallest one. Institutional and cultural are there's so many other things that affect the culture of racism and white supremacy within the country.
And I say that even students start to understand that. You'll hear students say like, well, how did this even get out into the public domain? And then you're like, well, then you need to understand the system this went through a system of approval, and how many people had to approve, like one artifact for it to get out into public domain. And so then they start to understand their place in that system.
Yeah.
So the next step is what we call define. And this is where we ask students to use qualitative or quantitative research methods to help further analyze or pick apart the either artifact, system, or experience that they've been given, or in a workshop as well, or in a place of practice. And so these are the cards that we picked out for the Chinese virus example, or the COVID-19 example. And one that we thought was interesting that I know we talked about yesterday, Terry, was conflict theory, a framework of understanding that suggests society is in a state of perpetual conflict because of competition for limited resources. And just the idea that he's perpetuating this idea that it's called a Chinese virus, or I've even heard it being called like a Wuhanese virus, or just the racism that he's projecting through this virus and through the media is being really harmful for people who are Asian or Asian American. And so we ask students within this, after they've done, or before they start doing their qualitative or quantitative research and picking out the research methods that they want to actually act on, to start with a question. And so we ask them to create a thesis question using this guiding question as an example. And we say, how might design be used to do a certain action in order to create change with specific stakeholders? And so we create a question using this example, and we said, how might, oopsies, I'm gonna skip to the next one. How might design expose the fallacies and blatant racism of the term Chinese virus in order to create positive change within the lived experience of Asian and Asian Americans with United States citizens? And so all of the research that they do would then go towards answering that question. So for example, students will run focus groups, or they'll run graffiti walls. They'll even run single guided interviews or non-guided interviews with either people who are in practice, who are part of that system, or people who are in academia who are trying to teach students to act against that system. And then what they do from that is they analyze the research that they've gathered, and they start to pick factors from that research. That way they can implement it into developing new ideas or reimagining the racialized design.
So we'll move on to step 3, which is ideate. And ideate is just a fancy word for ideas. So that's all they're doing in this step, is creating what are some new ideas. So here's just a photo of folks, trying to reimagine some of the cards that we've placed there, so that they can start to think about what areas of design, again, in those 3 areas, artifacts, systems, experiences, which is why this deck is so big, because when you think about all of the different artifacts, systems, and experiences that are designed, that's how the stack gets so long. So some examples of what an artifact we might be able to redesign to help with this example that we've talked about since the beginning is maybe we start to do some augmented reality. Maybe there's a campaign that's created to start to call out some of the blatant racism that's happening. There probably will be some guerrilla marketing, because if we are tackling a institution that's at such a high level, there might be some things that might be, taboo to kind of have on an official news network. So there will definitely be digital media, especially because we're in the age of COVID-19. So there might not necessarily be able to have print, so digital media. Things like a zine or sticker, or the educational system might be reworked, or maybe there might be like a module that comes out that says, hey, this is what our highest person in the highest office said. Let's talk about this today, about why this is racist. So maybe there are some things that we can start to reimagine. So this stack is really, really, really big. And it just goes through all the different artifacts, systems, and experiences. And it's for students to start to just kind of spark something, so they can start to see, okay, how can I bring in the educational system with a digital media piece and augmented reality? And what could that look like as a solution?
Right.
After they start to then create these solutions, we have them plot them on a quadrant map. That's at the very bottom of the third step. And on this quadrant map, we have on our x-axis, we have intent and impact. So how far does your idea move from just good intent? Because we all know good intent doesn't necessarily mean good impact or positive impact. So how far does your idea move from positive impact, positive or good intentions to positive impact? And then on the y-axis, how far does your idea move people from oppressive thought? So the oppressive thought is, in this example, that Chinese people, whatever Trump thinks about Chinese people, right? Relating them to the fact that they started this virus. So how can we move folks from that oppressive thought down to anti-oppressive action? So we want folks to move into action, just because, they're rethinking something that remember that changes just that small bubble of belief. We need them to move into agentic action, and then institutional change, and then into culture change. So how can we take, so the best ideas are going to be in that bottom quadrant there, that is most anti-oppressive action oriented, and the ones that have the most positive impact. So they'll fall into that gold square. So then, the students or organization who's working with the toolkit will have ideas everywhere, but the best ideas will fall into that space there. And like we said earlier, that you could, move back and forth through steps. Maybe they think something falls in a gold idea, and they go back and they interview, and maybe they're just like, nah, that was bad. That was a negative impact. So they'll have to move that idea, away from that, and then start to rework it. So that's what the quadrant map is for.
Mm.
And the next step is step 4, and this is where they actually start to prototype their ideas. So we work them through a low, mid, and high fidelity prototype. And these are the 6 that we picked for the Chinese virus example. One thing that really helps students is, like Teresa was saying with the previous step, is it allows them to test their ideas and then go back and define it again. So we'll have students come up with an idea, like I'm just going to use a digital artifact as an example. If they were to do sketches first and then develop like a click-through digital artifact, we constantly ask them to run back and test that with users. That way they can check their intent over impact and make sure that they're actually giving the message that's intended. And so we're constantly asking them to do that. So these are the different cards that apply to those different low, mid, and high fidelity prototypes.
And then the last step being impact. So then how are we taking what it is that they created? So they should have their hard deliverable at this point. And then how do they measure the impact of what it is that they created? And so, that last spread, that's like what that example that I gave about Aunt Jemima, this was their final work board area throughout the whole semester. This is what it finally looked like when they got to that last step. So some of the examples that we pulled out for the Chinese virus example was maybe there's analytics, especially if we're going to do something with digital media and it's a campaign, you can measure analytics, who's engaging with it, right? If we're talking about all US citizens, like are the ones that we actually want to engage with it, the really conservative or folks who are really big Trump supporters, how are they engaging with the media, right? Is there an implementation plan, or is there a new mission statement that maybe institutions of higher learning or educational institutions are using to help guide, media consumption? Are people able to pledge and say like, I pledge to do this or whatever, if I hear someone saying this term, Or what about reparations? Are there things given to folks who are being discriminated against? Are there huge fines that are actually partially given to the family of the person who, so there's a lot of, I think, really creative ways in which we can start to measure impact. Like, is the messages that we're communicating actually changing culture? And I think that's what this final step is about, is how are we measuring the actual change, not just the personal belief stuff, but the agentic action, the institutional change, and then the culture.
Yep. And we also provide, which you don't see on this, and I can pull it up for you, a rubric. Let me see if I can pull this over. And this is under the last step. And this is just to help educators understand how you would begin to grade this process. And so you can see the colors start to align with the different steps that we have.
We don't see it on the screen.
Oh, you don't? Oh, I'm so sorry. It's because of the way I'm sharing my screen. Let me just share this. Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So you can see the rubric. Okay. All right. So this is the rubric, and you'll see that the different colors align with the different colors of each step. And so the understanding goes directly back to the define, and you could either move the cards specifically to the step or just write in. And we often ask the students to participate in this step because it allows them to be a part of the grading process. I know there's different beliefs on that, but we have found that it can be giving them some agency within the class.
Absolutely.
And I think that's it. I think that's the last slide after this.
Yep. Do you have any questions?
Excellent. So I think that first, virtual claps. I can imagine all of my students giving you virtual claps. Thank you so much for, and I love the example that is so very relevant, I think, to a perfect example that's happening within culture that students can easily access and do their own research about. And actually, one of my students, we did a photo voice assignment earlier in the semester, and this was actually something, it's related to a topic that one of my students actually talked about in his research. So calling you out, student, know you are, did some research related to that particular topic. So thank you so much for sharing the toolkit, explaining it so thoroughly. One question I guess I would say, because I imagine that there are many students, or there are many students in our class that have different skill sets. This isn't like a design class, though. Is certainly there are a lot of designers in our class. We have talked about and I've done a lecture in our class about design by non-designers or design by everyday designers, or like design by all, that kind of idea that everyone is a designer. How might you encourage the student that doesn't feel as though they are skilled in design, or doesn't feel as though that maybe their end goal is design? How might you encourage them to see this toolkit as useful for something that they are interested in? It may be art, it may be marketing, it may be art therapy, it might be art law. And I'm asking you this knowing that this is perfectly applicable to any of those things.
Sure.
But you all, in your experience in working with students, make specific examples of how it can be applied.
I think we have run the toolkit. I know Lisa, for a fact, has run a toolkit with just like theater faculty. And so there are design is really just solving problems. And so what we've specified in this toolkit is we're solving the problem of racism. And so if all you're doing is solving problems, you can use whatever talents or gifts or things or research, whatever things that you're interested in, to be able to create positive change and anti-racism. So when we move through, I wish I had like the deck of cards at my office, and they won't let us in unless we have an appointment. But the IADS stack, we have a ton of stuff in there that that aren't designerly necessarily. So when we talk about, especially like the systems thing, we talk about like government agencies, and we talk about, I think we even have law in there. We talk about education, we talk about healthcare. Those are all things that like traditionally designers don't go into. And I think when we talk about design, again, just solving problems, recreating the space or whatever, I think we're talking about all different people with all different talents who can bring something to the conversation. Because I mean, if we're just waiting on graphic designers to solve the issue of racism, we're going to be waiting for a while, and it's going to take all of us, right? So
yeah, we're definitely looking at more of a contemporary practice of design. There's one book I would encourage you to look at if you haven't already seen it. It's called Design When Everybody Designs by Etsy Mancini. And that's a great book. I've shared some excerpts from there with students. But I would also say that in my undergraduate course, I had students from varying years. They weren't required to be in a specific year. So I had students from sophomore to their senior year. And what I found that they would work in groups, but there are definitely times where they would work individually. And the times when they would come together, they really supported each other in their individual efforts. And I found that that was really amazing to watch the students really like rally behind each other, and then not even just like show each other how to do things. And in the grad class, we very specifically have people who are not from a graphic design background at all. We have a social worker, architecture, somebody who has an undergrad in physics. So we are pulling from many different undergraduate experiences and still creating and making based off of those. And so it's just giving them, which I'm sure you are, but just giving them that space to make mistakes and then make again. And
yeah, I think that's thank you so much, both of you, for both of those examples. But that also makes me think of, and you both might have some thoughts about this, and this is kind of like, it feels like a term that people are using a lot lately to explain this, but the idea of design thinking. I know that at UNT right now, there's a lot of conversation in our design department about design thinking. So, and then that it's something that can be accessed by all. And even in other disciplines, or just in research in general, and project development, there is always this sort of design phase or kind of like development phase where I think that a lot of the same principles of design are there. It's a framework that I think that we can use in so many different ways. So I definitely just wanted to bring that up into the conversation for those students who are kind of need to kind of see design beyond just the graphic design concept. Any thoughts about the design thinking question?
I would think, I mean, so both myself and Lisa met in graduate school at UNT. So if folks are wondering, we were trained under this model of design thinking by Michael Gibson and Keith. So like the design research process is that visualized. Without design thinking, like what you're doing is trying to map out how am I recreating or some type of experience artifact or system. So that's what the whole design research process is just using that way of thinking to solve a problem. And so yes, it is absolutely able to be accessed by all, because anyone can work through Racism Untaught. Even if you're not a designer, you can still be creatively thinking of ways to be anti-racist, so
yeah. I was smiling when you mentioned
the
design program, because I just have such good memories with Michael Gibson and Keith Owens that I'm sure either of them would be happy to come and speak to you about the design research process and your students. And I believe they both have been through the workshop with us.
Yeah.
That's great. And was there any feedback that they shared in that workshop from their perspective?
I mean, other than we need to write stuff on it.
Yeah.
I
That's
mean,
probably
they
it.
really, yeah, they really enjoyed it. I think, I don't know, maybe it was when Keith came to our workshop, or if we were already
Yeah.
talking about this before, but we want to have a digital model, so that folks can access this outside of you needing paper to pin up stuff, blah, blah, blah. And so I feel like I feel the need for that, like, so much even now, right? Because we're not
Oh my
in
goodness.
classes.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Just thinking
So,
that. Well, and I think that you have it essentially in your materials.
mhm,
'Cause I'm even thinking about how in what you shared, how I can sort of create a digital
mhm,
kind of grid of the card deck and,
mhm,
just to kind of visually to show students like, hey, this is kind of like what you did in your presentation
mhm,
Mhm.
that
mhm.
allows students to just know the plethora of ideas that are available,
Yeah.
especially for that phase. So I feel like you definitely have it in there could be a multiplicity of different tools that you could use to just kind of help
Yeah.
students to kind of navigate it. But yeah,
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think it's awesome. Can't
Yeah.
wait to see how you do that.
Yeah, I was thinking in my mind something like a Google Docs type of thing where the workboard sits in the background and people are able to work on it together. Because I mean, I don't know. I think at the beginning of this process, we kind of thought maybe people could do it individually, but I think it has to be a group, just because you need those multiple perspectives. Like you need people asking critical questions. So yeah, I'm excited to see what
Mm.
happens this year with it.
I think that's why the why and why not became so important, because it
Hmm.
really created a space for requiring that the students identify why, and then the why not was just as important.
Mm.
And then we even started doing like a maybe. So like maybe the students just didn't know enough that that
Hmm.
should apply. And so I
Yes.
would say like, hey, put that in the maybe pile, and then we'll revisit it. And so then slowly those maybes would become a no or a yes.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're actually giving me a lot of ideas about how I can unpack this for students, especially in this digital format that we're
Hmm.
doing right now. So this is giving me a lot of ideas. We do have groups for the semester already. So
Sure.
even as I imagine these will be sort of individual projects, I think that the group ongoing conversation could is definitely I feel is necessary based on what you're saying. So that's definitely very helpful for me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that that's everything that I have for right now. And what I want to do is um, to give students access to this video so they can view it. And then I'll definitely ask if they have any questions. And then I can kind of refer back to you both on those questions if they do have any. And then we can kind of go from there.
Sure.
Anything else based on your experience in workshopping these ideas that you think students in this kind of course, where students are coming from different backgrounds of expertise, that they might be able to, anything that might just be helpful to think about as they move forward?
Um, I would say like I'm thinking about like not necessarily areas of expertise, but areas of experience,
Mm,
and backgrounds like culturally. And a lot of times, folks are really afraid to talk about race, because they don't have familiarity with it, or they're not Black or a person of color or whatever. And I would say like you know. Even if you are not a person of color, it doesn't mean that you can't be an advocate and a person who is working toward anti-racism. I don't have a disability, but I will fight for folks who do have disability. And I feel like if folks start to rethink racism in that way, and say just because I don't have that lived experience doesn't mean that I can't navigate that somehow. I don't know everything there is to know about race, even though I am Black, and I don't know everything there is to know about disability, and so I feel like We have to just get out there, and it takes years to get to a place where you are actually comfortable, but you do have to start. And I would say your higher education, like this point in your life, is a pivotal moment for that. Like, go ahead and start now, make mistakes now, get corrected now, and continue getting corrected. Like, it doesn't happen when you get your degree that you're like perfect. But I would say start now so that, you know, you have that understanding of like, okay, this is what happens when I mess up. I apologize, I move forward, I continue pushing, right? And so get familiar now with the material so that you can start to make an impact in your professional world. As you go out there and become a professional, whatever, you can start to question things that aren't right. Even if you don't sit in that place to actually make that decision, you can actually send the email and say, hey, I noticed we did this and this and this. It doesn't sit right with me. It kind of oppresses or marginalizes other individuals. And so you'd be able to kind of spark some of those conversations.
Yes, yeah. One thing that I would encourage is to have students or yourself come up with community agreements that allows for a safe space for all those conversations to occur. One thing that I found helpful is to have those up when you know you're going to have times where those conversations are going to become maybe a little bit more uncomfortable for certain students. And so it really does create some very simple rules, like, you know, I'm only speaking for myself. That one sometimes I take too far because I like get so worried that I don't want to speak for anyone else. But just being very cautious of your own actions and the way that you're speaking about something. Because even myself, I'll even get a very, what do you call that? Like imposter syndrome when I'm talking about these things. And this is something that I have to talk about and that I want to talk about, and I still feel that way. So I know that students are feeling that way as well.
We actually just did which was in partnership with our diversity and inclusion office, a Keeping It Real virtual potluck and roundtable. And so one of the aspects of that roundtable was the office has kind of rules of engagement, and so it kind of explains a lot of what you just said about how to engage in these conversations. So I can imagine including that same material as students are engaging in this toolkit as well. And it was I think students have provided some feedback on the roundtable. So it seems as though it was helpful to be able to have those conversations and be able to speak freely. So glad you mentioned that as well, because it definitely references back to something that is another tool that we can apply in the conversation. So
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for your time. I know that we're all going through so many interesting things and navigating this new normal, which we're all dealing with. But I appreciate you both just being willing to do this at this time, and I think students will really appreciate your toolkit, and I think that I'm hopeful that they will learn a lot from it, and it will be something that they can take with them moving forward. So
Awesome.
Thank
you
you
for having us.
Yes.
thank you so much, and we'll chat soon.
Okay.
Okay.
That
All right.
sounds
Thank
good.
you, Lauren.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.